all for joining us. Today, Kanita and I are going to be talking through some strategies for foundational skills to be queer inclusive in the classroom and in your school buildings. So if Kanita, you will go to the next slide. For anyone joining us, my name is Avon Cook. I am the high school DEP resource teacher, and I will let Kanita introduce herself.
And I am Kenita Ballard. I am the DEP resource teacher for AAS elementary schools, but I also chair the district-wide LGBT advisory committee.
So today we wanted to talk, and this is part one of a two-part session. Tomorrow we're going to be back on at 11:30 with a follow-up. So for today, we really only have two distinct goals. We want everyone to walk away from this understanding the nuances between identity, sex, attraction, and gender expression. We also want to make sure that we give you all the ability to address in appropriate terms anyone who classifies themselves as LGTBQ, and then the vocabulary that you need to discuss issues that are directly related to the LGBTQ community. So those are two session goals over the next 25-ish minutes. If you are participating with us in the chat, couple of session norms to be mindful of and things to keep in mind as you wade into this work, especially if you've never done cultural competency or equity work before. Kanita and I ask that you be present, that you assume good intentions. So we will be monitoring the chat between the three of us. So if you have a question, please feel free to ask. We are here to help you understand, and we just ask that you assume good intentions of anyone else. Give respect. Everyone is working through this from their own lens and their own lived experience. And then, of course, the most important one, be comfortable with discomfort. We only have 30 minutes with you today and another 30 tomorrow. We're going to be covering some essential things to know, but this work will in no way be finished when you end this session. And that goes for almost anything regarding culture or equity. Kanita, anything to add?
Not at all, but if you have questions past today and tomorrow's session, again, our contact information is available throughout this presentation, so please reach out so that we can support you all.
So if you are at all familiar with privilege surveys, it's pretty common in equity work. There is a survey and it's linked there, the heteronormative survey, and we wanted to talk through a couple of questions on it and what that could mean in terms of growth. So if Kanita, you will go one more slide for me. Thank you. So this was taken from work done by a researcher and published through the Gender and Sexuality Center back in the 1970s. But if you look and you're familiar with privilege surveys, you'll notice some alignment of the questions. So for example, what do you think caused your heterosexuality? When and how did you first decide you were a heterosexual? So when we think about these questions couched in the understanding of LGBTQ students and their experiences, or perhaps students who are heterosexual but whose family members are part of the LGBTQ community, it kind of gives us a way of thinking through our own privilege and our own biases. If you are part of the dominant or normative culture, the assumption is that that is standard for everyone else when that is not necessarily the case. So when we're thinking about gender and sexuality and how those interact in the classroom and what we can be doing to be cognizant of how we're approaching students and their families and the larger community, these are things that will kind of push on your own understanding of where gender and sexuality kind of intersect. So when we talk about LGBTQ, a lot of people fail to realize that there are a lot more labels and identifiers out there. So the couple that I want to speak to, and then Kanita, if you have anything to add, please do. A lot of people fail to realize that one of the A's in the big long acronym is ally. I know a lot of elementary and middle school teachers aren't necessarily comfortable with the idea of approaching subjects of gender or gender expression in the classroom, but it becomes really important to ensure equity with students, that we are teaching kids early and often that there are lots of different people in the world, and that all of it is okay and that all of it should be treated with respect and with understanding. The other two that I want to hit on is HIV affected, which is a subset within the LGBTQ community. Here in Louisville, we've been doing a lot more work in the last years around making strides with that and making people aware of resources available to them in the community. The other that I will speak to very, very briefly is Two Spirit, which is an umbrella term within the Native American culture, and it encapsulates a person who has both male and female spirits within them. There's a lot more to that, and it's a lot more dense in understanding. But because that is not my culture or my lived experience, I don't want to speak to it because I am not an expert. Kanita, are there any terms here that you want to speak on?
Well, I'll just make this general statement that when we're talking about the what does it all mean as it applies to this very large community, we have to be able to practice and engage with the skills of listening and inquiry because some of these terms are applicable and some of these terms aren't, depending on the individual. So, for example, queer is not a term that is embraced by the whole of the community. There are pockets and individuals within the community that will speak to having a queer identity and using that as part of their labeling. But then there are other parts of the community and individuals that do not wish to be associated with that term. So we really have to be critical thinkers and listeners and askers as it concerns finding out how do people want to identify.
And then, Kanita, if you would for me, could you click on that hyperlink?
Yes.
So what we've linked here for you all is a glossary that is from Teaching Tolerance, and it goes through all the different terms that you may or may not hear. As Kanita said, there are terms that some people within the community will adopt, and there are others that have fallen out of favor. But the main thing is that we are being open and that we are being inquisitive and accepting, exactly like Kanita said. Asking is much better than assuming. And as you will go through this resource, you'll see that there are a lot of terms that we didn't hit on. But that is there for your perusal. And if you have any direct questions, please do not hesitate to ask. As Kanita said, we are here to help. So if any of this feels confusing or feels off, let us know. This interface is not the best for this type of work, but we're going to make the best of it. So one of the things that we have referred to briefly is this idea of gender, right? And gender constructs. So when we talk about gender identity, we tend to talk about a person's internal sense of being female, being male, or being something else altogether. But very frequently, especially in American culture, we equate sex and gender as the same thing. So if you have a female student who does not identify as female, their gender expression is more masculine, or their gender identity is in fact male, he, him, his, we tend to have difficulty in our American society understanding that because we equate a person's sex when they're born with the gender that they will assume. But gender identity and gender expression is fluid, it's multifaceted, and there's a lot of things going on socially that helps us construct that. I mentioned earlier that I know a lot of elementary school teachers aren't necessarily comfortable addressing the idea of gender in the classroom, but because it is such an innate part of American culture that we equate a child's sex to their assumed gender, it's really important that we start developing in kids young this understanding that gender is not binary. Gender can be many things, and that we have social constructions and assumptions around what it should be, but that it's not always necessarily the case. Kanita, anything to add?
Well, and just when we enforce a specific narrative of that there is this binary, we can actually contribute to more harm than good. And so we'll oftentimes see within students that identify as trans, we'll see these common themes, these common narratives of students who found themselves in school experiencing suicidal ideation, bullying, just extreme bouts of depression, because they did not necessarily have support or understanding, and something that was furthering their disconnect between their identity and their expression, because of the school. So we can also approach this from a holistic standpoint, in that we as the institution of school and we as teachers, we can be advocates for our student, and we can have inclusive practices to really support the social emotional identity and development of our learners as it pertains to how they see themselves and express themselves as it applies to their gender expression and their gender identity. And in the next slide, we're going to have more information about how that gender binary is harmful. So go ahead and take it away, Aiden.
So, for those of you kind of struggling to delineate between sex and gender, or gender expression or gender identity, I know we are throwing a lot of terms at you. So, again, if you have a question, don't hesitate to ask. We're here to answer them. But for those of you who are struggling to wrap your head around what is the difference between a person's sex and a person's gender, if you think about a close friend finding out that they are soon to be parents, one of the first questions that we tend to ask is it a boy or is it a girl? When really we are asking about the sex of the child. But from a very young age, we condition children to fall into this gender binary. Girls are associated with dolls, the color pink. If a girl is very demanding or forthright, she's much more likely to be labeled bossy rather than she's a leader. She's a natural born leader. And the same thing can be said of boys. We tend to think of the color blue, tools and trucks. They don't really get encouraged to play with dolls or anything else of that nature because that would be considered feminine. At the same time, it's also where you get some harmful phrases like boys will be boys. So when we think about what Kanita said, how we are nurturing kids in a way that is healthy for them. This isn't just going to apply to our kids who may identify as trans or who may grow to identify as part of the LGTBQ community. When we put kids in these boxes, according to the gender binary, we're also telling them that they can only be one way. So when we learn to talk through that with kids when they're young, they grow up to be adolescents and teenagers who are very well versed in their own understanding and their own gender identity and expression, but they're also more accepting of people who may be outliers. So you will see less confusion around females who are also doctors. You have a lot of scripted stereotypes that you can pull from just 20 years ago, and you can see where the gender binary breaks down, and what we deem perfectly normal today may have been extremely abnormal in the 1950s. So tracking it through time is also very useful if you're trying to break down that gender binary versus biological sex. Kanita, anything to add here?
No, other than the next slide is one of my favorite slides, because it's a visual representation and organization of some of the concepts that we were speaking to.
So if you are a visual learner, this is definitely for you. So everything you'll notice exists on a scale that can basically be described as masculine to feminine, or feminine to masculine, however you want to say it. So when we talk about your gender expression, we are talking about the outward appearance, how you dress, what types of clothing you prefer, how you present yourself to the world. Typically, people express their gender in a way that matches their gender identity, which is how you define and see yourself and how you understand yourself through this optic of gender, which can exist in a non binary state. Attraction and sex are very, very different. People tend to shy away, again, with younger children, from talking about issues within the LGBTQ community because they don't want to confuse it with sex when really we're not talking about biological sex. We're talking about attraction, we're talking about love, we're talking about who you choose to spend your life with. So if you are a visual learner, this may also help you kind of break down where we're talking about things. And today we are rooted very deeply in this understanding of gender identity, gender expression, and how we can kind of break down gender binaries in our classroom. Tomorrow, we are also going to be talking about, as Kanita alluded to earlier, what happens when we as teachers aren't being advocates and aren't being allies to the LGBTQ community.
And also one thing to point out is that we really have to step back from this idea of a binary of male female, because ultimately it does not make sense, because something like a gender identity and a gender expression, there's fluidity within those identities, and we have seen that within our own pop culture figures with someone like Prince and Little Richard, figures who had fluidity in their gender expression, even though their biological sex was male, even though their gender identity fluctuated between more womanness or manness, depending on them. But we really have to take a step back from this is what men look like and this is what women look like, because it's nothing as concrete as that. It's something that can ebb and flow.
I really like that graphic. Coming from the elementary education world, I was thinking like, yeah, how do I address this? But seeing attraction and sex as two different things, I'm like, yes, an elementary teacher can discuss attraction. Thank you. That's a great graphic.
And please reach out to Avon, myself, or Monica, as we also do have additional resources specific to elementary schools, as well as LGBT book list for what are elementary appropriate LGBT picture books and chapter books to include in the classroom. Avon, go ahead and take it away from approaching inclusive language, an example.
So I have to give a huge shout out to our fellow RT, Rachel Klein. She shared this with us. This is just one example. This is from JSPS Middle School of how we can have inclusive language in a very simplistic way. So you can see this says Student Bill of Rights, and I wanted to highlight a couple of these in particular. So one, to be called only by your given or chosen name. So making sure that students understand the importance of referring to someone by the name that they have chosen for themselves to be known in that classroom environment. To be treated with respect and dignity by the school community as a whole. That means all aspects of your identity are affirmed, you are seen as an individual, and you are given the resources that you need to succeed within that classroom. 11 is just, it kind of makes my teacher heart happy to be included. There are very few students who strive to not be seen in a school day. For a lot of our kids, especially those in marginalized spaces, coming to school, connecting with a teacher can be something that is a lifeline of sorts for them. And again, we're going to get into that a bit more tomorrow, in terms of things to watch for, things to look for, because we know that this group experiences a lot more adverse childhood experiences than the average. And then, of course, 14, not to be teased for being different, because at the end of the day, our perception of different is based entirely on dominant normative culture. So if you think back to the heteronormative survey of when did you first realize you were heterosexual, that isn't a question that you would expect from another person, because being heterosexual is seen as normal and everything else is seen as different or other. And depending on who you are, you may be seen as problematic for identifying in those ways. But we as teachers can be advocates and allies by understanding that what is different is simply defined as anything that is not the dominant culture. So those are voices and communities to amplify, to listen to learn from, and to protect when we can. One of the easiest ways, and we're going to do some exploring here in a second. So, one of the easiest things that you can do as a first step, especially if you are in the classroom, is practicing speak up strategies. So, I know having been in high schools, I will hear kids call each other out of their name in the hallway. And even though they are not arguing, it's not going to lead to a fight, there are certain phrases that it will trigger me. And my kids got to know very quickly what things would get them into a lot of trouble with me. And the thing they hated most was when I went on lectures. So becoming comfortable with a term that just kind of stops everything. Asking a student, well, what do you mean by that? Tell me more about that. Why do you think that? And depending on your teaching style, you're going to find a phrase that suits you better than others. My favorite was just acting extremely confused and asking a kid, what do you mean? And it gets you quite far with adults as well. So learning to interject yourself into those moments, because you never know who's in your classroom and you never know who's listening. And again, we aren't just talking about this through the lens of LGBTQ students. If you're an elementary or middle school teacher, your student may be in a home environment where their parents identify as LGBTQ. So learning to take those moments that feel uncomfortable and creating teachable moments around them is really important. Kanita, if you would click on Speak Up Strategies. So what we've done is embedded some more resources, and I think off this slide, most of them are from Teaching Tolerance, and they are going to walk you through just some things to think about and some things to look for within the classroom setting. Kanita, I'm having issues with my screen. Can you talk us through what you're looking at right now?
Okay, so essentially, the Speak Up Strategies is it's a catch-all resource for how to respond and engage and disrupt prejudice, bias, and stereotypes. And so that guide will walk you through not only how to implement these strategies as a teacher, but through a variety of role groups as well, from counselor to administrators, as well as how to support students and using speak up strategies to be disruptors of bias themselves. Because the one thing that we don't want to do is we don't want advocacy and support to be solely on our teachers. It takes an all hands on deck approach to really again be disruptors and prejudice, bias, and stereotypes. And similarly, we do have from Teaching Tolerance as well another guide for best practices for serving LGBT students. And I will say that this is another resource from Teaching Tolerance. This is applicable to the physical classroom, but there are resources in here as well and strategies in here that apply to our current situation as well. In fact, Teaching Tolerance does have a specific resource for how to support LGBT learners in distant learning environments as well as during COVID. Because one thing that we have to keep in mind is that some of our families, our learners are coming from places where school was their safe place and space. And home was not necessarily that for them, given their identity. So we want to be able to continue that for them, making sure that they still have access to a safe place and space. And so those are those resources. And we're going to go ahead and conclude. Are there any questions that we still have around ideology or terminology? Are there any inquiries as to what other types of additional resources are out there? Because we tend to see a tendency for elementary schools to put off LGBT engaging with LGBT populations for the middle school and high school. But again, we want to be able to have the most inclusive places and spaces that we can. That's the classroom. And we have students that might identify as cis so that they they were born a female, they see themselves as a female, but they have family members that are part of the community. So again, we want to make sure that we're not putting barriers for our families or our learners to be their most authentic selves. Also, what are some takeaways that you have from today's sessions? What are your next steps? And then ultimately, how can we help you take that next step?
I've been
So,
monitoring the chat, and we have a lot of people interested. I don't see any questions at this time for you to address. One thing I was thinking about, like I said, I come from the elementary world. I have noticed recently our library media specialists are doing a great
yeah.
job about getting books out there and getting them displayed so that kids are like, oh, that kind of interests me. I'll check that out. So I've been very proud of what I've seen in the libraries. Yes.
Definitely. One of the things I loved about being an English teacher is the level of empathy you can help students build through books simply by exposing them to something that is not normal for them, but is in fact perfectly normal. To add on to what Kenita said, I think it was less than a week ago, we are seeing gay men being targeted in pockets of places where they are doing heavy testing for corona. And it kind of likens back to similar issues in the LGBTQ community. So just being very aware of, as we are all experiencing this global pandemic, and it's not easy on anyone, this is a very difficult time, there are groups of people who are going to be further marginalized. So when we enter back into classrooms, we want to make sure that we equip any teacher who is willing and able to best serve their students and to create a welcoming and inclusive environment for all students and their families. Because again, you may not have students that are out or who are comfortable being out in your building, but they may have LGBTQ family members that they go home to at the end of the day. So finding a balance between creating that safe space, but also creating space for conversations is really what we are hoping the takeaway will be here.
And tomorrow we're going to go more into those nuances of what steps you can take, as well as to what are some of the specific implications of engaging or disengaging with LGBT learners and populations within the school. But we're also going to be speaking to the intersectionality component of this conversation, because we also have to keep in mind that we have students that have intersectional identities, and when they're being oppressed for their external identity of being a brown person of color, woman person of color, male person of color, their internal identities can also come under attack. And so what we don't want to, again, is we don't want to contribute to harmful practices. We don't want to contribute to disconnecting our students from themselves.
Agreed. Kenita,
yes.
Will you go just one more slide? I want you to send this off and finish this out, but I didn't want to forget this.
Yes. Thank you. And so one step that the district is trying to take as a whole is trying to shift their culture and climate to be inclusive and supportive of LGBT learners, but also our LGBT JCPS staff and family. So we are currently forming a LGBT employee resource group. It is open to new staff. It is open to current staff, but this is a employee-led network that is open to any and all that are part of the community or interested in supporting the community. And so we are having a JCPS virtual event on May 20th, 2020 at 4 p.m. on Google Meet. And so JCPS Pride is the code. And again, you can also see this being retweeted on Twitter. You can also find this, I believe, was it the JCPS forward?
Yes.
You'll see this in a number of publications, but the invite is standing and it is open to all staff that are supportive of the community. So we hope to see faces there. Well, not there, but virtually. And so with that, as it is 12, we're going to go ahead and close out. But again, any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to reach out to Avon Cook or Kanita Ballard, and we'd be more than happy to support you all.
There were a couple. There was a question come in at the end. Just teachers wondering if they can get. Is there a list of resources about books they can use?
Yes. And so if you contact so schools also have LGBT support coaches, but given that we're not in physical places and spaces with our teachers and our support coaches, they had the LGBT book list, but please contact me and I'd be more than happy to get that out to you. As well as possibly finding who is the name of your LGBT support coach, because our LGBT support coaches at each school has a number of resources for how to work with families, how to support trans students, et cetera, et cetera.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Avon. Thank you, Kanita. Great information. We're glad to have you here supporting the staff and students of JCPS.